Unlocking the ocean's resources can create more development, more population growth and land.
So one that really surprised me most was one of 4,000 years ago.
It brings together the ancient, the Renaissance, the age of discovery, and modern day research.
Leonardo da Vinci, always precursor of everything, is the first one that designed an alembic specifically to the salt water.
This is the Leonardo da Vinci design.
I believe this is the first time it is actually published. Nobody believed that 100% they would make it. The first desalination techniques were probably to make alcoholic drinks, to improve the alcoholic content, even confidential messages between Kennedy and Brown.
The father of the modern membrane technology.
We need a breakthrough to go to a new stage where it will happen. A new technology that will enable us to desalt or to create fresh water with alternative methods will come out.
Seawater, when it evaporates, becomes drinkable, and what has not evaporated does not return to seawater. We shall now only say that, as far as the sea is concerned, a part of it can be taken and turned into drinkable water.
Welcome to the Salty Water Podcast today. Today we have a most interesting presentation. We're going to talk about the new book on the history of desalination entitled The 7,000-Year Story of Seawater Desalination by Emilio Gabbrielli. I found this book fascinating, and to me, it brings together the ancient, the Renaissance, the age of discovery, and modern day research and technology development. We can find out perhaps what Cleopatra the Alchemist and Leonardo da Vinci and John F. Kennedy all have in common. For those of you who don't know Emilio, he was born in Florence, Italy. He has a chemical engineering degree. He's been in the water business for several decades. He's lived all over the world, and in addition to his engineering and technology prowess and membrane separation experience, he's also the Renaissance man. He's an artist, he's a published author, and he's a playwright. And it's great to have you here, Emilio. Welcome to the Salty Water Podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start off. You've done a lot of things in your career and amazing things all over the world. But what motivated you? Can you share with our listeners why you decided to write this book? It spans 7,000 plus years of history. And what surprised you most during your research for this book?
Yeah, look, probably because I come from Florence, but I've always liked history. And through my career in desalination, I've always liked to read whenever I could. I found the sources about the ancient history. And I was amazed to find things like that the Greek and the Roman ships happily desalted water across on the Mediterranean on their trips, and then discovering also that closer to us in the 19th century, mining in Chile started and cities started only because they relied on seawater desalination 100%. So obviously it was something that seemed interesting to research. And also I was surprised because most young people especially, but also older desalination people, they thought the desalination was something from the 20, 30 years ago. They didn't realize that it's one of the most ancient technologies that mankind found. And in fact, even if somebody reads my book, they will see that I talk a lot of things of desalination in prehistory. I cannot prove them. So they had the tools. They discovered how they salt water, so they could have used it if they needed it. And that is probably the thing that most surprised me. Even the Incas and the Aztecs, before the Europeans came there, had discovered how to distill water, and obviously they could have produced fresh water if they needed it. The Indian subcontinent, the Chinese, all knew how to do it.
So it really goes back to how mankind organized himself around survival and using techniques to make clean water and fresh water for survival.
Yeah. Let me say, though, that probably the first alembics and desalination techniques were probably to make alcoholic drinks, to improve the alcoholic content or perfumes. But once they knew how to do that, obviously they knew how to dissolve water as well.
I think in your book, you start out with some new archaeological finds, perhaps in Greece, if I recall correctly, that actually stimulated your interest in this ancient part of the technology. Can you talk about how new archaeological finds influenced the history.
Yeah, well, until 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when I started researching in depth for writing the book, my understanding was that the alembic, distillation as we know it, started really with the Arabs in the 7th century of our era, and that the earliest alembics had been invented in Alexandria,
Right.
and the famous Cleopatra the Alchemist. And I was very proud of the fact that it was one of the few cases, probably the only case, where a woman had invented something that was so important to mankind. But it took me only 2-3 weeks of trying to touch up some things from the old times to find out alembics 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000 years old, and they didn't
Wow.
seem to have surfaced into the broader knowledge. I don't know anybody in our desalination community that knew about this. So one that really surprised me most was one of 4,000 years ago, in fact, that was found in an industrial complex in Cyprus 4,000 years ago, a beautiful, big distillation device that could have easily distilled quite a significant amount of water, certainly enough for a family on a day if they needed to distill water. In that case, it was used, yes, to produce perfumes, it seems, but there, it was there, so this knowledge was there. And I found all this very, very interesting.
That's very, very interesting. And expand a little bit on what Cleopatra the Alchemist, who was she, and what was her contribution? How did she actually use this technology?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we are very lucky because she wrote a book to produce gold. And one page of this book survived. And on that page, there is the drawing of the earliest alembic that had been written in literature, so to speak. And although it was not about desalting water, but it was about distilling. And so you could see that she had invented this. It's very interesting because Cleopatra's name is very connected to desalination in some ways, because Cleopatra, the Cleopatra that most people know, that the Queen of Egypt, was sieged in Alexandria. In fact, the same Alexandria. So Alexandria is a city that really talks of desalination with Caesar, and they were sieged, and Caesar saved itself and the Romans, waiting for the helping army coming, by finding fresh water under the sand. But he knew that it was because there are rivers that go under the sand. But it's interesting that most people, until Francis Bacon in the 17th century, they believed no, it wasn't. There are no rivers going under there. It's just that he was lucky that he found water that had been in sands, which had the capacity of desalting water.
So now jumping forward, obviously, as man began sailing more and more and advanced the naval maritime industry, desalination spread and improved in technology. What can you say about life on the ships, both in the early days and then in the more modern days, and how that influenced the development of desalination technology?
Yeah. Well, basically, the ancients had already identified, and when we say identified, we have to go to the historical part. The Greeks started writing about desalination. So since then, we know that they knew, and they kept writing all the centuries up to the discovery of America, so to speak. They kept on writing on 3 methods, which are exactly the same 3 methods that we use nowadays. So they thought about them. But it was in a more academical way than a practical way, until obviously the discovery of America. And it's funny, just before the discovery of America, my friend and a township fellow, Leonardo da Vinci, always precursor of everything, is the first one that designed an alembic specifically to desalt water and use it. And it's very interesting because he also used a concept that then was taken up on board without knowing it by many captains who just did an alembic out of nothing. Basically, he designed an alembic which stays on the side of a normal oven that you keep in a kitchen. And normally in those days, you kept the kitchen running all the time because it was the rich people. And so he doesn't say it, but it's obvious that he thought, well, you've got this fire that goes on all the time. You may as well have the alembics, one on each side of the oven, so that you use the heat at least to produce distilled water while you are there and you have it. And so really, basically, from the moment that America was found, the Europeans started going in very long trips, desalination boomed. And in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, you have got tens and tens of books of scientists, of treatises that really speak about desalination and how it can help and permit the long voyages that the Europeans were interested to carry out.
And I think this is the device that you have on the cover of your book. This is the Leonardo da Vinci design.
That's right, and I'm very proud of the fact that I believe this is the first time it is actually published. I mean, it is part of the Codex Atlanticus. So if there is a copy of that, but it's about 2,000 drawings of Leonardo, you find it there. But individually, as a drawing, I have found no evidence that it has ever been published before.
Yeah, interesting. So, desalination also as a geopolitical issue and a force for economic development obviously has grown and flourished initially in the Middle East and North Africa. What can you say about how the transition to land-based desalination really changed things for the economy in that post-World War II era?
Yeah. Well, as I said, desalination really started to be used very intensely on land in the 19th century. But when we go to World War I, all of a sudden the navies were using desalination on board. But when we get to the Second World War, every basically ship, a military ship, had a desalinator on board. And during the Second World War, there was also this awareness that petrol, oil, had become really the motor of economic development. And at the end of Second World War, also there was this awareness that the biggest amount of oil available was in the Middle East. And these countries didn't have water. And so there was immediately after World War II a push to develop desalination plants, no longer small enough basically for a ship, but something huge that could really help a country to live with their fresh water. And it's amazing because in a span of about 20 years, from 1960s to 1980s, countries like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, they really became dependent on desalted water for most of their water usage. Without that,
Right.
it would have been very difficult to have the explosion of oil production we had, but also the explosion of those societies as working and flourishing groups of people living together.
Yeah, you think of the Bedouins moving from water hole to water hole on a seasonal basis, trying to survive in the desert, and with very little water resources, such water scarcity. Desalination creates the economy, creates the community, creates the social fabric for these people to not be nomads and Bedouins anymore.
That's right. And actually, let me say one thing, that when I talk about these huge plants, they were obviously based on distillation. There is the old technology. But there was another technology that was starting to develop, the one based on membranes, which would have in fact displaced distillation as a main means of production of fresh water. But the amazing thing to me is that one of the indirect contributions came from the Cold War and from President Kennedy being shocked by the Russians sending Gagarin to the space and realizing that the Americans were behind. And so basically with von Braun and the others deciding to take this leap of faith to put the man on the moon by 1970. But, I've studied what was written, even confidential messages between Kennedy and von Braun. Nobody believed that 100% they would make it. And so there was Johnson, that as a good Texan, they knew how important desalination was, suggested to Kennedy, why don't we make a big effort to make desalination become cheaper and more effective? Because if we don't get to the moon, at least we can say that we've solved the problem of the water in the world. And it's very funny because when Kennedy finally announces this, he keeps on saying that there is no other undertaking of mankind that is as important as this. Okay, and it is
Right.
true. Water is what is very more important for people. But from his point of view, he's saying well, if I don't get to the moon, at least water is the most important thing. So I've already put my chips on the right technology or a right bet.
I would also add that I was born and raised in New England, and Kennedy was a sailor and a yachtsman, and I think he appreciated the ocean. And then, of course, he was in the Navy during World War II. So
Yeah.
I think he probably also had some firsthand experience with how salty water is, what it does, when it's all over you and you're out on the water.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about, I'm always fascinated by the fact that that research program that he started at the same time he started the moon launch program effectively led to the development and the commercialization and the patents for what we now call the seawater reverse osmosis membranes. And that research program lives on today in a completely different format. But in many ways, that program that he started in 1961 became the father of the modern membrane technology.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, there was an incredibly lucky coincidence because basically Kennedy said this in 1964 and 1960-61, first in Florida, but then especially at the University of Los Angeles, the UCLA, they had developed the first commercially viable membranes in reverse osmosis. But when I say viable, they were taking out enough salts that you could have fresh water produced, but you have to find out really how you make this commercial, how you produce this in great quantities, how you fashion the elements through which you can do it. I mean, it was all laboratory stuff. And the fact that Kennedy put money into research of desalination fell in the perfect grounds, and in fact, it enabled these research which were going on already in the States to really to multiply and to gain pace. And as already in California, there had been this breakthrough at the University of Los Angeles, somehow California developed, in fact, as the hub of reverse osmosis. And in fact, still now, probably most reverse osmosis membranes are produced in San Diego. So all this reality may have come to that eventually, but certainly the facilitator was Kennedy, and make this happen certainly in many or fewer years than it would have been if he didn't support the technology.
Yeah, it's a great example of how government can stimulate with focus and attention and money great breakthroughs in science and technology. With that, again, based upon all your experience, the research that you've done for this book, I know at the end of the book, you talk about sort of a catalog of various technologies, but what do you see coming in the future, maybe short-term and or long-term, as everything keeps developing and we have incremental improvements in polymer science and membrane technology? Obviously, energy recovery had a big role to play, 25 years ago in reducing the energy requirements for reverse osmosis. But if you put your crystal ball out there, what do you see in the future?
Yeah. Well, the three methods that have been coming along and from the antiquity and now are also our main ones. The one of distillation, reverse osmosis, and also ion exchange, which is a form of desalination that we don't normally talk when we produce fresh water for drinking, because it is desalting water which is already with little salts. So it's not really what you use to produce fresh water. But distillation and reverse osmosis cannot be improved much. Reverse osmosis is very close to the thermodynamic minimum of energy consumed. So we are towards the end of the road. And in fact, now the innovations, so to speak, the things that make it cheaper to use reverse osmosis to desalinate water are different configurations, like putting the plants on the bottom of the sea so you can use the pressure of the water or the like, or the commercial sides, or details. So we need a breakthrough to go to a new stage where it will happen. And as I say in the book, I don't have any doubt that this breakthrough, so a new technology that will enable us to desalt or to create fresh water with alternative methods will come out. Whether it is from the sea or whether it is from the air, because you can condense the vapors on the air, I wouldn't know. But there is so much research, and so much need, that, as I say in the book, it took millennia or hundreds of years to get to new technologies. This time, by the time we get to say 2050, I'm sure that this new disruptive technology will have appeared and it will start displacing reverse osmosis. It could even be that it's a variation of what we call today reverse osmosis, but it cannot be the same thing because that is getting to its minimum of cost and energy that you can use to use it.
Shifting gears a little bit, there's a lot of controversy around desalination in some places, especially in North America. Environmentalists have concerns about outfalls and brine being put out back into the sea. There's concerns about how unlocking the ocean's resources can create more development, more population growth and land. So there is political controversy. I know in Texas right now, they're going through quite a bit of community issues in Corpus Christi and so on. But what should people know? And if there were to be a documentary film based upon your book, how would you portray what we've learned from your book in the context of what would help people to really get their heads around the fact that, the fundamental issues around making fresh water out of seawater are not new, and it's been as long as mankind. But what are your thoughts on how this story could be told in a visual and more graphic way through a film?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I've been involved for many years in all the associations that deal with desalination, and I like to try to speak to people often about desalination because I feel the need, in fact, to dispel so many myths that prevent the potential of desalination to help mankind at this point where it is so important. Desalination is not a panacea that should be used irregardless and it solves the problems, but certainly it's one of the main ways we have to solve our water crisis. And it doesn't help if there are things which are not understood. So when I speak, or if there was a documentary, I would like, in fact, to think that it contributes to people to realize that many of the things we talk about are myths. It's like the problem of the discharge of the brine into the ocean. If you send it out in the wrong way, if you don't design it properly, sure, if you send so much salinity in a colony of lobsters or the like, they will not be very happy probably. But we know so well how to do it properly. There is no way that you cannot design an outfall that doesn't have any environmental effect whatsoever. And in fact, there is so much a documentary could go and see how much analysis and checking there is on the effect of the existing desalination plants around the world, which are thousands these days. They come always back with the fact that there is no impact. So that is a myth that the documentary could dispel, but also that the desalination is too expensive. Well, it was too expensive before energy recovery and the reverse osmosis merit, so to speak. But now it's no longer. In many places, surface water of bad quality is probably more expensive to make potable than distilling water where you need it. And it is a fact that it is environmentally, in fact, very, very safe. Why? Because when we start trying to get water from basin to basin, so we alter the hydrology of places. So whereas you take too much water out of aquifers that are not replenished in time, so you can really create environmental effect. If when the cost is similar, one should desalt water, because if you make sure that you get rid of the brine in a safe way and you resalt your water, you don't affect the environment and you protect the environment. And therefore, your rivers will have their flows not affected by too many withdrawals and the like. So all these things should be able to be highlighted in a documentary. And after all, as it is already more 5, 6, 7% of the population of the world already drinks water desalted from the sea every day. So we are talking of a huge amount. I don't know how many viewers of a potential documentary would be aware of this. But if a documentary went to see these places and people happily drinking the water and how it supports healthy societies with a healthy sea that is not affected by the brine, that's great. Also, and the brine sometimes or eventually will disappear as a problem because more and more we use the brine to produce other products. So by the time the brine becomes a product in all places, then the problem goes away by itself,
Really?
even if it is not a problem. It's of a problem in the mind and not in the reality of technology.
Right. I think all of those are valid points. And we're coming to the end of our time today. So I want to thank you. Or let me ask you before that, if there's anything else you want to add before we wrap up for today.
No, look, I'm thankful to you for the interest in what I've written. And I really feel like a preacher after a long time in desalination. And I feel so much that it will help ensuring a decent life to everybody, that every option I'm given to pass this message, I really am pleased. So thank you, Eric.
Just a word, if you could, about where people could find your book if they're interested. We can also post it, on the podcast. But if people want to get your book, how do they do so?
Yeah, well, I mean, they can easily go to Amazon, and I'm pleased that after 1 year of paper books only, the publisher has made available the Kindle option. So I suggest if people want to buy the Kindle, you can go in Amazon. But if you want to go to the paper copy, you can go in Amazon or to the publisher's site, which everybody can easily find by searching the book in Google.
We'll post it on our podcast as well. So thank you so much, Emilio. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and appreciate your time today, and hope to see you soon.
Today is an important step towards the achievement of one of man's oldest dreams, securing fresh water from salt water. The government of the United States and the people of this country take pride in this research enterprise, which holds such high promise for meeting one of man's basic needs in areas where nature has not been generous. I'm sure that before this decade is out, that we will see more and more evidence of man's ability at an economic rate to secure fresh water from salt water. And when that day comes, then we will literally see the deserts bloom. This is a work which in many ways is more important than any other scientific enterprise in which this country is now engaged. It serves the interests of men and women every place. It can do more to raise men and women from lives of poverty and desperation than any other scientific advance.